Hello everyone. Hopefully I'm not cutting everything off this time. I have a tendency to do that. Today we're talking about early European settlement, Spain, France, and the Netherlands, in the second installment about American history. Some essential questions for this unit. What factors contribute to the establishment of England's North American colonies? And we're going to discuss some of the differences in colonizing experience of Spain and England. And specifically, we're going to get into today some of the particulars about Spanish settlement. All right, so the first thing, within a decade after Columbus gets there, thousands of Spanish conquistadors, explorers, etc., venture through Mexico and southward into Peru. And you have these conquerors, these soldiers who are coming through and trying to find what riches they can after Columbus discovers gold. And the conquistadores are typically professional soldiers and sailors recruited to fight for the church, fight for the crown. And there's also other people joining, but I do want to note the majority of these individuals are men, as in this time the majority of soldiers were men, and the majority of people who would be going on these expeditions were. And I note that because it becomes important later on when they start to settle. Okay, and these Spanish explorations opened the New World to European settlers. Hundreds of new villages ended up getting established throughout the United States, Florida, through Texas, and into California, all over South and Central America. And Spain really completely changes the landscape of the Americas. Okay, with events like the conquering of the Aztecs. Now, I do want to note that it is a myth that Cortez came in and defeated the Aztecs single-handedly. Oh, by the way, if you could hear strange noises in the background, that's my wife raking outside, right out my window here. Sorry. So you've got the Aztecs who are defeated, but the majority of that defeat comes, one, at the hand of disease that the conquistadors brought that spreads throughout the Aztec Empire, and specifically the city of Tenochtitlan. And then also from the 20,000 plus soldiers and villagers from outside of the Aztec Empire that had been preyed upon for years by the Aztecs. Okay, then you've got, moving on, Spanish exploration and extraction. So like most 16th century Europeans, the Spanish wanted precious metals and people to work for them. So they brought a lot of soldiers. They didn't bring a lot of miners or anything like that. And so what they ended up doing is exploiting the people there until enough of them died, and then they were importing slaves, oftentimes via Portuguese contacts or other European contacts from Africa. So it's the Spanish attempt to repeat earlier patterns of settlement by the conquistadors, and they end up needing a formal government. And when they start to establish villages and towns and cities in the New World, excuse me, and the individuals that are set to lead these areas are the viceroys. Now, the viceroys come out of a social class called the Peninsulares, which we'll discuss in a minute. And the viceroys are representative of the old order, the old feudal system. They're just called something different. Instead of being called a duke or a count or a baron, the viceroys are essentially right underneath the crown, in that they are territorial rulers that are then paying tribute back to the Spanish. And then they rule over an area, and then they give smaller parts of the area that they rule over to people that they trust, And these smaller towns where they're ruling over Native American villages are called encomiendas, and we'll see that in a second. And so you find that they discover silver and gold throughout the Americas, and it is really either the native population or slave labor that is extracting these resources from the land and being shipped back to Spain to then inflate their market. So let's talk about the colonial caste system from the Spanish perspective. First, you have the Peninsulares. This is from the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. That's why they're called Peninsulares. Peninsula, Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula that Spain is on. And these individuals are born in Spain and they're sent to rule, essentially. And they are the highest caste system, or the highest. They hold the highest position in the caste system. And then you've got the Creole, which are people of Spanish descent, born in the colonies by two Peninsulares, so both of European descent. And then you've got the Mestizos, which is Native American and European mix. This is a large portion of the population that is mestizo, because, going back to what I said earlier, they didn't bring enough women to support colonization without intermarrying within the local population. And this does two things. One, it makes rebellion more difficult, because in order to rebel, oftentimes you'd have to, kill your brother-in-law or your father-in-law or something like this, or your father. If you have conquistadors or people of Spanish descent who are marrying into the native population, those people are then becoming family, and so it makes it more difficult to rebel. But what it also does is it changes the culture and the landscape both for the Native Americans and the Europeans, and you find a completely new and different culture that is a mixing of the two and then creating something different than had existed before. Also, random note, if you can hear heavy breathing in the background, I don't know if you can see this, but my dog is sleeping on the chair back there. Okay, moving on. So, and then you have the mulatto peoples, who are people of African descent and European, who have had children. And then you've got Native American peoples and people of African descent. So this pyramid is as racist as it looks. You've got ethnically people born in Spain, their children here. So these people have the most power. These people have a little bit less power, because people are sent to rule typically. These individuals are their children. And then you've got the mestizos and the mulattoes, who might be free, but they're not seen in this society, and they don't have as much power. I don't really know how to phrase this without saying it as racist as it is, because it just is. Okay, these people, because of the color of their skin, were discriminated against. Period. Okay. And then these people here, the Native Americans and people of African descent, were often treated as slave labor and subhuman. Like, it was just absolutely horrible. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like, this system was very, very racist. Period. All right. So, stages of colonial settlement. Maturation, from extraction to settlement. So it's maturation. You're growing from the birth of the colonies into something where it's more permanent. So Spanish soldiers come to the New World, help conquer and settle the Americas. For Spain, mentioned this earlier, they are oftentimes brutal and very harsh to the Native American population, and they take over in some places Native American villages and create what are called encomiendas. And so favored officers are given land ownership of these Indian villages, and these Indian villages that are being controlled by the Spaniards are called encomiendas. and they served as protectors, but not really. They're using the native oftentimes as slave labor in this case. Okay, and with every Spanish explorer were conquistadors and member of the Catholic Church to Christianize the Indians with God, gold, and glory, and this is their mantra. And I really want to note here that they said God, gold, and glory, like they were putting God first. However, it was more gold than glory and then God. They're there seeking wealth. They're there seeking fame and riches. And then at the tail end of that, in a lot of cases, the Christianity is forced upon the native peoples. It's no wonder that there's a lot of people who, remember this type of history, have resentment towards the Christian church. With things like the mission system, where oftentimes the native people were required and beaten if they did not wear a Western style dress. They weren't allowed to speak in their own languages. They were stripped of their culture, their traditions, etc., and basically told, Christianize or be beaten and hurt, or sometimes killed. And I read an essay recently about this. I can't remember the name of the author, but what the essay was explaining was that these individuals, these native peoples, were living in a quote-unquote in the new world as well, right alongside everyone else, because their entire way of life was completely overturned, and because of rampant disease, and then these Europeans coming in and conquering and changing things, they lose their territorial homelands, they lose all their traditions, and it's really a tragedy that there's so much of Native American culture that is lost. And for Christianity, it would have been a much more powerful message if more individuals had been like there's a man named Bartholomew de las Casas who spoke against forced Christianity during this time period and was an advocate for bringing people into the church via love and compassion and preaching the gospel as it was intended. It's just a tragedy that things were done the way that they were done to the Native Americans. Okay, so confrontation. So disease cripples the Native American populations. It's estimated upwards of 90% of Native American populations were, or 90 to 95% of Native American populations were killed throughout the Americas by smallpox, measles, typhoid, whooping cough, dysentery, cholera, alcoholism, etc., brought by the Europeans. I mean, you're talking 9 out of the 10 people that you know being killed via disease. Right now, it is 2020, and we have a global pandemic going on. And then people are frightened and they're scared and they're staying in their homes. But it's not 95% of the population that is being killed because of this. I mean, this completely devastated most Native American societies. And the biggest disruptor in their lives was disease. Now, did the Europeans do terrible things? Yes. Were there some that did not do terrible things and they tried to live in peace and harmony and with the Native American populations? Yes. We're speaking in generalizations because they're useful in this context when you're talking about large spans of history. There are exceptions to these things. However, the facts remain that the majority of the Native American population throughout the entirety of the Americas was wiped out via disease, and then the Europeans were often absolutely terrible to native populations, whether you're talking about the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Germans, the English, the Scots, etc. were coming in. So extraction, getting gold and silver bullion into Europe was not easy. So too much gold is like too much birthday cake. Okay, if you eat a slice of cake or maybe a couple slices of cake, you might be very full and you have too much sugar in your system, but it's not going to really cause you a problem. But if you try to eat, say, 3 whole cakes in 20 minutes, you might have a problem. And this is kind of what this is like. So what happens is it drives up inflation all across Europe as they're bringing so much gold back. Spain is bringing so much gold to Europe, raising inflation by 300 to 500% and completely disrupting Europe's economy. It was a large problem that took some time to steady. Okay, Spanish snapshot. The Spanish employed fewer resources in farming and more researchers in science and engineering during this time period, and also military technology, writing and military technology, with things like the iron-tipped plow, the windmill, the water wheel. These things are freeing up people to pursue other things. I mean, just the invention of the windmill or the water wheel makes it so that an individual doesn't have to use a pestle and mortar to, crush grain and to turn it into flour to then, make bread. As bread is at this time a huge staple of staple food in the majority of Europe. If you have something where you can have a miller who produces or processes all of the grain and turns it into flour for an entire community, it frees those individuals up to do other things. So they're not spending so much time on tedious activities, and with more time comes oftentimes more invention and entrepreneurial activity. So the Spanish had more than a century's head start over the English. They're genuine empire builders in the classical sense. For all the terrible things they did, they also, developed an empire in the Americas. They went about it in a way that modern peoples would be shocked and horrified over for, human rights violations. But they did create an empire, and it says paid the highest compliment. But I mean, it really it is more than the Europeans. They intermarry with the native peoples, and it fuses the cultures, like I said earlier, as opposed to their English counterparts, which typically tended more towards killing Native Americans or having them isolated into their own communities than truly accepting them and intermarrying with native populations. Okay, switch over to France now for a bit. So France comes out of a civil war in the 1500s to European masters in the 1700s, and you've got a Catholic or Protestant. You've got Protestants who are found within the country who are fighting against the Catholic majority, and you've got France attempting to emulate profitability of the early Spanish settlement by subsidizing their own voyages of exploration. So they're coming out of a civil war, and they are wanting to capitalize on this new world, and so they send people to, along the coast of Canada, to the upper Mississippi, the Ohio River Valley area, the Great Lakes area. 1608, Champlain starts the first settlement. St. Lawrence, which the St. Lawrence River is named after, tries to exploit the fur trade, and they find that, I mean, it's much harder to grow and produce cash crops in Canada. But what they do find is animals that didn't exist in Europe that then can be harvested for their fur and sold back in Europe for a significant profit. But they don't create a strong settler society. And the question I ask in class is why not? And this is the scenario that I go for. I ask all the ladies in class to raise their hand if they would like to move into the wilderness for the rest of their life, build a log cabin, live off the land, and make their own way in life with very little human interaction. And typically one or two women will raise their hand. And then I ask the same thing for the men, and typically over half of the men raise their hand. It is what it is. More men chose this life than women did. So you don't have a strong settler society because the French aren't really intermarrying with native populations like their Spanish counterparts did. And also, they did not bring enough women over to really settle and create families, etc. Okay. Primary activity was religious and trapping fur, things like that. And the government only sees minimal returns from colonization because the primary trade is essentially furs and trapping. It's not extract and mining, massive mining operations like the Spanish found, or cash crops later on like sugarcane, for example. And they forbade immigration, unlike the English, from the Huguenots. The Huguenots are that Protestant minority who was, instead of allowing them to immigrate to the Americas, they were prosecuted and persecuted within their country in France. So they're unable to support and fund additional exploration as well, because they enter into a series of very costly wars with England. Also, the French monarchy was spending an extravagant amount of money in their own country and in colonial enterprises all over the world, and they didn't see the long-term profit in America because of where they decided to settle. Okay, the Dutch. So the Dutch East India Company was a monolithic company, rivaling most large countries at this time. They had a full-blown navy and military. I mean, they had ground troops as well as a navy, and they are the first true multinational corporation that spans the globe. The Dutch East India Company is huge, very, very important, and we often speak of them in history at this time being the equal of the other countries who are vying for territory and power. And they're a joint stock company. So what that kind of means is you've got individuals who buy a stock, typically it was actually a physical piece of paper back in this time, where you buy a stock, which means you own part of that company. And as that company grows more profitable, your stock becomes worth more money. And hence it encourages more people to buy stock as stocks expand. And the company, as it grows, people become wealthy from this, okay? As joint stock companies, they were private mercantilist tools with guaranteed trade monopoly in exchange of rights paid to their respective governments. So the Dutch East India Company was given special privileges by, the Dutch and some other companies or countries to operate throughout the world, which made them more profitable. Because how mercantilism typically works is everything is set up to put everyone at a disadvantage in trade, with the exception of the mother country, or the father country, whatever, the country of origin that businesses and colonies are coming from, where you've got raw materials who are supposed to be shipped from colonies, who are then going back to the home country, being processed into finished goods, and then shipped not only back to the colonies but all over the world. The Dutch East India Company is given some exceptions to these policies and is able to grow and become massively profitable and wealthy. And they're an example of how modern multinational companies operate today. And like I said, they're almost states unto themselves. And they organize exploration of the Hudson River. They're still seeking the Northwest Passage to East Asia. They're trying to find a way over there. In the 17th century, they become a major commercial world power, like I said earlier. And the immediate goal is exploitation of fur trade in the woodland interior. And then New Netherlands, which is New York today, where they settle in what is now America. They find in what is today New York City and the harbor there, they find a great harbor to set up a trading hub in North America. And then they also find farmland that is more usable than their settlements in Canada, and they don't care as much about the color of your skin. They're looking for profit. I mean, this is typical of multinational corporations today. It's less about the color of your skin and more about the amount of money that you bring in. So it becomes the most culturally and ethnically diverse settlement in North America. You've got immigrants coming in. They don't care what religion you are, as long as the women can work and help make the settlement profitable and the Dutch East India Company profitable. They don't care as much. And so you see capitalism actually bringing people together in this case. All right, Henry Hudson, veteran English navigator, goal to reach the Northwest Passage. He, along with the Dutch and the French, are going on these exploratory missions to try and search for this Northwest Passage that they never ended up finding. So you've got a lot of different ethnicities and people who might not traditionally be working together, who are kind of intermingling in the Americas. But they are still segregated. I mean, there's 18 distinct different languages being spoken in the streets of North America at this time, or in 1644. And they're not, it's not what they call a melting pot. And, historians have called it that, where they're all intermingling and becoming one people. It's really not like that. There's a lot of different cultures and people who are interacting with one another. I heard a professor once say that it's less of a melting pot, more of a stew. Like, there's distinct things that you find in a stew. There's, beef and potatoes and carrots, and they're still beef, potatoes, and carrots, and they're next to each other, but they all have their own distinct flavor, and they're not, wholly alike the other. And today we still see this today. Henry Hudson here, and we're going to end this presentation. Pick up next with the English and and why the three areas that are settled in the north, in the middle colonies, and in the south, why they ended up developing distinctly different cultures from one another. And then, still comparing and contrasting them a little bit to their French and Spanish counterparts. Thank you very much for watching this video. Have a fantastic day, everyone.